evening. I know it's been a minute since our last time together. It's great to see folks. As a reminder, thank you, Ingrid. It's great to see folks. As a reminder, Ben Duncan, the facilitator for the RAC. We have an exciting agenda, a lot to move through, so I'm going to be really brief to get us started. We're going to do a roll call here in a minute. We'll review our meeting guidelines, some other housekeeping. Actually, if we can go to the slide, I think 2 slides with our agenda. So we'll do our welcome and overview. I'll pass it to Ethan here shortly to talk about where we've been and reflect on where we're going, provide some updates on the work that's happening in parallel and in alignment with the work that you all are doing in this space. We'll then bring in Anita Yap, who will orient us to LCDC's racial equity framework that's really foundational to ensuring that as the technical advisory committees and as this rulemaking advisory committee conduct the work, that racial equity considerations are embedded in our process, our discussions, and ultimately reflected in policy direction and rules. We'll get brief updates from housing accountability and capacity technical advisory committees before spending a bulk of our time in discussion on needs and production, really centering on types and characteristics and location of housing, particularly connected to affirmatively furthering fair housing. So we'll then move into closing and send you out on your way by 12 p.m. So I'm going to do a quick roll call. And so for folks, you can ignore all the everyone because the public doesn't see chat. So just be mindful of using chat. So don't worry about changing your settings. I'm going to do a roll call instead of just asking folks to just move around the room, if that's okay, just to ensure our time. So if I call your name, just say here, raise your hand, or I, whatever indicates that you've acknowledged that you're in the room. I'm going to start. It'll be in alphabetical order. Ariel Nelson. We'll keep it. Actually, it's not in alphabetical order. It's just in order of. So this will be, well, Alan Lazo. Maybe it is. Alan, I thought I saw you.
Here. Yeah, I'm here. Thank you, Ben.
Yep. Alan Hines.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alan. Ana Molina. Ann Kelly. Becky Baxter.
Here.
Thank you, Becky. Benjamin Gurwitz.
Present. Thanks.
Thank you, Benjamin. Beth Barker Hidalgo. Brandon Persinger.
Here.
Thank you, Brandon. Brian Rankin.
Good morning, everyone. I'm here.
Good morning. Brock Nation.
Morning.
Sarah Phipps.
Good morning. Here.
Morning. Chantal Levenso. Sorry if I'm butchering names.
No, you're good. Chantal Juvenso, present.
Thank you, Chantal. Corey Harlan.
Here. Good morning, everyone.
Thank you. Dana Hicks.
I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. David Madison.
Here.
Thank you, David. Lisa Gertler.
Here. Hi.
Thank you. Garrett Pryor. Garrett Stevenson. Sorry, Garrett's today. Gloria Sandoval. We were noticed that Holly and Jessica were not able to make it. Jim Johnson.
Hello, everyone. I'm here.
Yep. Julia Metz.
I'm here.
Thank you, Julia. Kelly Glenn. Kathy Wild. Thought I saw you out there.
Yes, I'm here.
Yep, thank you. Kelly Hart.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning. Thanks, Kelly. Kim McCarty. Lindsay Hutchinson.
I'm here.
Thank you, Lindsay. Lucia Ramirez.
Lucia's here.
Max Cunningham.
Here.
Thank you, Max. Then we had Mary Kyle, who couldn't be here. Maxine, I think was not going to be able to make it. Maxine, are you here? No. Megan Bolton. Saw you out there, Megan, somewhere.
I'm here.
Yep.
Morning.
Morning. Mercedes Elizalde. Mercedes. Michael Rock. Miranda Batishell.
Good morning. I'm here. It's Bait Shell.
Bait Shell. Thank you for teaching me, Miranda. Patricia Diefendorfer. And Rachel Mori Bidu, I also don't think could make it today. Ryan Vandenhoof. Richard Rogers.
Here.
Thank you, Richard. Sean Hobbs Waters. Shane, help me with your last name. Kwiatkowski.
Kwiatkowski. Happy sunny day, everyone.
Happy sunny days. This is sunny in my neighborhood, but I'm going to embrace that.
It was a joke, I promise.
Okay, well, I'm going to embrace that sunny attitude. I appreciate that. Shannon Villauer.
Here.
Thank you, Shannon. Ted Reed.
Good morning.
Thanks, Ted. Tara Wilcoxon. Sorry.
Good morning. I'm here.
Hey, Tara. And Victor Saldana.
Here.
Thank you, Victor. Anna Molina, I thought I saw you come into the room. Can you say here? Maybe not. Okay, is there anybody that I didn't call that has showed up after I passed your alphabetical name? Oh, Samantha Bayer, I know you were in the car driving. So we'll note there. Gloria? Thank you. Gloria
Yeah.
Sandoval, I see your hand up. You're here.
Yep.
I see Patricia Diefendorfer coming in. Thank you. Ariel, I see you. Okay, did we miss anybody else? Great. Well, thank you for embracing that process, and thanks for being in the space. So if we go to the next slide, I'll be brief with our meeting guidelines, really asking folks to listen and seek to learn and understand others' perspectives, respectful, candid, constructive discussions, resolving differences, finding common ground as an advisory body, discussing topics together rather than isolation, and efforts to avoid surprises. And I'll just add certainly that we're also wanting to share space as part of my role as a facilitator, especially in a big group like this, is ensuring that we're giving as many opportunities for as many folks in this room to contribute in the best way possible. So just know that if you're a constant hand raiser, I might ask you to step back. If I haven't heard from you, I might invite folks in. So please just respect the space and really embrace the idea that we want to hear from as many folks as possible. Couple other pieces, if we go to, just that actually you can go back up. Just the last note around submitting comments. So there's a couple pieces, and Ethan, if I get this wrong, please add some additional context. But with open meeting laws, it really is not appropriate to be emailing the entire RAC roster, whether that's policy ideas or just sharing reflections and information. It's outside of the bounds of serial communications. So we do ask that if you'd like to submit comments, there's kind of two ways to do that. And one, if you want to share something with the RAC, please email the housing.dlcd@dlcd.oregon.gov, include ONA rulemaking -RAC. And then if you want it for staff only, you're just submitting some feedback and reflection for DLCD staff, please put that in the subject line. If it's for public comment, that will then become part of the public record formally and included in documents as such. Ethan, was that accurate? Okay. So if we go to the next slide, just meeting goals. As we get in, really key themes, I walk through kind of the agenda. We're going to hear from the work that's been coming out of the TAC, and then we're really going to spend the bulk of our time in some key topic discussions around needs in production and accountability, to provide policy direction to inform kind of future TAC conversations and ultimately future conversations that this group will have. So with that, Ethan, I'm going to pass it to you.
Thanks, Ben. Hi, everyone. For the record, my name is Ethan Stuckmeyer. I'm the manager of the housing division here at DLCD. I get the pleasure of talking with you for just a brief couple minutes about where we've been and where we're going. Obviously, we haven't met as a group since December of 2023, and a lot of things have happened on the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Program and policy since then. And we'll kind of just do a really quick overview. The majority of the conversation today is dedicated to discussion, so we'll get there as quickly as we can here. All right, so since your last meeting, lots of things have been happening, as I've already mentioned. Obviously, this group met for the most recent time on December 12th for the kind of the first two kickoff meetings, kind of those orientation meetings. And as you might remember, there's a rulemaking advisory committee and 3 technical advisory committees that are supporting DLCD in this work. That group of technical advisory committees met for an orientation also in December, and then we took a break. We took a break for the 2024 legislative session, knowing that was going to be a key session in terms of housing policy. And just want to kind of point out 2 bills here: Senate Bill 1537 and Senate Bill 1564. Some of that work has an intersection with this process, and you'll hear about that over the course of the rulemaking process when it's applicable. But really, in March is when we reopened this advisory committee process, first with the technical advisory committees. We wanted those folks or those groups to begin to have some of the conversations that the rulemaking advisory committee can opine on it through this meeting and others coming in the future. We've actually had a whole suite of technical advisory committee meetings through the month of March and early April to inform the discussion that we're having today. And I also want to kind of highlight that outside of DLCD's specific work on the rulemaking for the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, OHCS and the Department of Administrative Services are also working on elements of this program, including the housing production dashboard and equity indicators work. And I just want to kind of shout out the OHCS folks who are in the room today for kind of following along on our process as we follow along with yours and try to integrate that work as best we can. So with that, talking about what are we actually working on today? Obviously, you've got the packet of materials in front of you, hopefully, or can pull it up quickly. But really kind of wanted to highlight some of the pieces here. The guiding principles document that we've shared with you all in November and December of 2023 has been updated given the conversation that we heard at those meetings. You'll see some of the reflections that we found from the Mira board activity that you all participated in during that meeting have been reflected into that document. So that's there in agenda item 2. I want to kind of point out some of the new work or the new documents that DLCD and the project team have published since December, really, which are these explainers and policy briefs. And I think those as a collection really give a really good framing for how DLCD and how the legislature and how OHCS and those folks are thinking about the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis and the impact that it has on the Goal 10 and the Goal 14 process and how cities and communities engage in that work. So definitely take a look at those. And then really the rest of the packet is focused on kind of summaries and key takeaways from what we heard, what DLCD heard in the Rulemaking Advisory Committee and Technical Advisory Committee space. And that really creates the basis for the conversation that we hope to have with you all today. And then just the last note here on the Rulemaking Advisory Committee and TAC meeting schedule. I think there was some question about how many meetings are we actually having throughout 2024, and we put that all in one handy place for you in agenda item 11, just so that you can take a look at the entirety of 2024 and see which advisory committee meeting is happening when, and figure out how you want to plug into those various committee meetings. All right, just kind of regrounding ourselves in this process. Obviously, I've talked about the Rulemaking Advisory Committee and the Technical Advisory Committee integration and connection. And really, I think what's important to kind of highlight here is that the Rulemaking Advisory Committees and the Technical Advisory Committees are all serving a similar purpose to inform the department's recommendation to the Land Conservation Development Commission, who are the ultimate decision makers on how these rules will be adopted and in what form and fashion. But there's a back and forth relationship between the Rulemaking Advisory Committee and the Technical Advisory Committees, which I want to kind of highlight here. This group, the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, is kind of tasked to advise DLCD on the policy of these rules. What does it mean to actually do some of these things? How do we ensure that the legislative intent of House Bill 2001 and 2889 are coming through in the rulemaking process? And the Technical Advisory Committee process is really to kind of advise on the technical details. How exactly should the rules be written to actually fulfill that policy intent? So I just want to kind of highlight those two differences in approach and the types of conversations that we expect those advisory committees to have. So really quickly on some of the things that are happening outside of the Rulemaking Advisory Committee process. Obviously, the department's engaging in quite a few additional conversations outside of this space, and kind of highlighting those here. We're focusing on working with our regional representatives to do some regionalized conversations about the specific context in particular regions across the state. We'll conduct some focus groups on with partners and groups kind of not represented on the advisory committees or traditionally engaged in these kind of methods. We'll focus on engaging with some community groups to do, I would call them community-led events, so kind of smaller group discussions. And then OHCS and DAS are kind of working on other engagement activities related to that kind of equity indicator work and the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis methodology work. So things to plug into in the future, and we'll share more details when those are available at a future date. So I think that concludes my section here, Ben. So back to you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ethan. And so I want to bring in Anita Yap, and Anita is playing a really important role in providing leadership on the racial equity framework and help us understand the why and the how that we can use this framework. And Anita's also here as we have this conversation to help bring this conversation and this framework into all of our discussions, right? And so will be a valuable contributor. And Anita, I encourage you to continue to, jump in and support the RAC as we engage with the framework, as we move through our discussion today and subsequent conversations as we go forward. So take it away.
Thanks, Ben. Hello, everybody. My name is Anita Kinkinglani Yap. I am a consultant hired to provide assistance for racial equity for the RAC and also to support DLCD in a number of measures. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the framework of why we're doing this and how we're going to go about it in a manner, and just have some conversation if you have some questions. So we'll start out. You may have seen this in your packet, the Racial Equity Framework for Decision Making. So Ethan, if you can go to the next slide. It has 8 different categories, as you can see here on the slide. And I'm going to go into some questions. What I'd like to say first, this is a framework that was developed by the Land Conservation and Development Commission. And I see we have Commissioner Alan Laszlo from LCDC here. So thank you for your leadership on this. But this framework is set up for DLCD for any rulemaking programs or projects. So this was adopted back in, let's see, August of last year. So this is probably the first rulemaking that we're going to be using this with. And so this is a really important framework for reporting back to the commission, and it's pretty comprehensive. So I'll just kind of touch on each one of these and some of the questions about that we're going to have to answer for the commission. And we're hoping through the work that the different TAC meetings will be having this discussion and also integrating it into some of the RAC meetings as well, so that we have some robust conversations so that we can show the commission that we've really thoughtfully looked at this through not only the technical components, but also through the advisory, through the RAC membership. So the first category is historical inequities, and there's 4 questions. How does the rule address historical inequities for communities of color? If the rule does not address historical inequities, what are the historical inequities? How can the rule lessen historical equities on communities of color, and what mechanisms under the jurisdiction of the Oregon Land Use Planning Program can assist in reducing historical inequities? And what additional information or data do you need to address this question, and where will you get it? So again, this is going to be answered by DLCD staff with the assistance of all of the RAC members and the TAC members. The next one is benefit and burdens. What are the benefits and burdens of the rule, which include financial, environmental, and social? Who will benefit from this action and who will be most burdened? How will burdens be mitigated? How might burdens be redistributed? And identify possible unintended consequences and how we would mitigate that if we found out later. And then analyze and consider benefits and burdens to future populations. So you can see a lot of these are really qualitative answers to the best of our understanding, and that's really important to be thinking about as we build our understanding related to these concepts. The next one is data equity and data justice. And so this is really talking about is the data and research you're using for analysis is using a data equity and data justice focus? If no, where might you obtain this data? If data equity and data justice are not available, what would you suggest as a way to obtain this data? And is there qualitative data available? The next one is community engagement and empowerment. So what methods and what are the racial and geographic demographics of communities engaged in the development of this rule? Were there any specific issues raised by communities of color about the impact of this rule, and what are they? And did this impact or change the development of the rule? If yes, how? And how has the DLCD advisory committee engaged with this rule, with other policy advisory committees, the citizen involvement advisory committee, the local government advisory committee? Next, we have accountability. Does this rule address accountability measures for both DLCD and local governments? What are the accountability measures for this? How will DLCD track compliance, and what are the incentives and disincentives for not meeting the compliance? And do the accountability measures include engaging with communities? If yes, how is this done? If no, why? And what are the challenges and opportunities for accountability for DLCD and local government, and what are some ideas to address this? Restorative justice. How does this rule provide for restorative justice for the communities most burdened? Or does this actually provide? If yes, what are they? If no, what would you suggest are within the jurisdiction of the state of Oregon? And what are some other best practices, for examples, for restorative justice measures that would address the impact of the rule most burdened? These examples can be outside the jurisdiction of DLCD, but could provide concept ideas, sharing with tribal communities, local governments, businesses, and culturally based nonprofit organizations. I think some of the recent restorative justice talks about some of the land back movements that we've seen actually here locally as well. So that's one example. Decision making. So who are the organizations, individuals, and communities that have influenced the final rule and recommendations? How does this rule address racial equity in decision-making for local government implementation? If this rule does not provide an approach for racial equity in local government decision-making, what would you recommend? And then the last one is measuring and evaluating outcomes and continuous improvement. How will the DLCD measure racial equity impacts and effectiveness of this rulemaking? How can DLCD assist local governments in tracking, measuring, and reporting outcomes? And what additional resources are needed to accomplish this? So that's a rather comprehensive list of questions, pretty tall order, But as we move through this rulemaking, there'll be opportunities for you all to weigh in. It's really important to hear from you, especially because some of these will be written into rule, and there any sorts of technical assistance or questions that you might have, it's good to raise those now. We're also looking at folks who are doing as advocates and people with lived experience to really share how they experience this and how they would like to be engaged also. So folks who are doing the implementation, local government, affordable housing developers and others can understand really the focus of this housing that we're rulemaking that we're doing. So I'm going to pause here to see if there's any questions before I move on to the other regulatory requirement.
Yeah, thanks, Anita. So let's create any space for questions on what Anita just introduced. Commissioner, we wanted to add?
No, thanks, Ben. And Anita, I just appreciate the work that you've done. And I really appreciate the way staff has brought these elements into the RAC and the tax and really looking forward to and appreciate folks really trying to wrestle with these elements as we're working on the technical work that we're doing.
Great, appreciate that.
I would also suggest to the folks of the RAC and also members who are also on tax, to keep this racial equity framework close. And so if you end up having questions or would like to provide comments, you don't necessarily need to wait for the meetings. You see there's an email that allows for RAC comments, because some of this takes some deeper thought. So I really would recommend you take this framework and think about it in particular and what sort of support you can provide to DLCD and LCDC in really making sure this is intentional and that we're thinking through other things, because this is a pretty long list, but it's probably not as comprehensive as it could be. So looking for you all's support and participation.
Great. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any questions for the moment, but that doesn't mean there won't be questions later. So let's keep going.
Let's move on to the next. So another process that's required, this one is required by the state. So House Bill 2993 that was passed in 2021 amended ORS 183. So this is a statutory change, requires agencies to develop a racial equity impact statement as part of rulemaking process. It also included some changes requiring members of state agency RAC, Rules Advisory Committees, must, this is a quote, represent the interests of persons and communities likely to be affected by the rule. And it also must identify how adoption of the rules will affect racial equity in the state and attempt to determine the racial groups that will be affected by the rules and how the rules will increase or decrease disparities currently experienced by those groups. So this is another one. This is statutorily required. And I think that the biggest change as following House Bill 2993 is many rules advisory committees had the same people as far as advocates and other people who benefited from the rules participate. So this was within the legislature saying that they really wanted to hear more voices when rules are being developed. And also identifying how the adoption of this will affect the folks that are most impacted by these types of rules. So this is pretty groundbreaking requirement by all state agencies in rulemaking. So as part of this, we'll be looking at, it dovetails really nicely with the Commission's racial equity framework, but also note that this is statutorily required. I think my role here is also to support the RAC to meet these requirements as far as interests of persons and communities likely to be affected by the rule. Who are new to rulemaking, the technical components are sometimes complex, and understanding local governments are the ones who have to do this implementation, that framing this with folks from these affected communities in the rulemaking process is really important to making sure that it's really focusing on the people who this is supposed to be focused on. So any questions related to that?
Great. Thank you, Anita. So, yeah, let's open it up for questions and just reiterating, right, that, as you said, Anita, your role to support the RAC to meet these requirements, but also to really embrace and embed the racial equity framework and all that we do. So, and I just will say, I love the way you said, hold it close, right? So as we move through these conversations, I'm going to ask you all, right, to embrace what Anita just described and holding it close and really bringing it in to the conversations we have. But any questions around either reflecting back on the first slide around the framework or the requirements under HB 2993?
So I'd like to add when the leads for the technical advisory committees are going to talk, they'll talk a little bit more about the process of integrating the racial equity framework into the agendas and discussion. Those of you on some of those tags may have already seen that, but we want the RAC to know that we really want to work on this integration within the TAC, the technical components, and we'll be working together to bring these back to the RAC for feedback, questions, any sort of other ideas.
And what a amazing segue, so I will pause just give folks another moment if there's any questions, thoughts, or reflections. But that was a really good, Commissioner, jump in.
Sorry, thanks, Ben. I was frantically looking for my raise hand icon. I couldn't find my thing. I just want to reiterate kind of what both you and Anita said about holding this framework close in the work we're doing. And also, I think it's a particularly good space for the RAC to hold as this sort of overarching body. It's a good place for us to come back with the technical work that's happening and say, is this fitting into the framework, or has the framework been considered in what's being brought to us and what we're moving forward? So, I think particularly for this group, and I know it's hard for a lot of us are on the different TACs and in the RACs, and it's hard to keep track of who's doing what and what our role is. But I think this is a particularly good space for those of us here in this group to make sure that this framework is being followed and is deeply embedded in the work that we're doing here, because it's so closely tied to issues around racial equities and racial inequities.
Right. Thank you, Commissioner. Okay, Anita, do you want to add?
Before I close, I just want to ask if anybody on the RAC has any ideas. I know I covered a lot. You've seen the framework. If you want to tell us what your thoughts are about this, if you've even thought about it, or what are some concepts that you think are important for us to focus on?
Shannon?
Yeah, so this is just something that I feel like has come up a little bit in the news and production TAC, that there's sometimes a gap between intended impact and current engagement capacity, potentially on the parts of municipalities, for example, that there's maybe a set of skill set and maybe important like trust-based relationships that are not necessarily present today. And it's really encouraging to hear about some other engagement that DLCD may be doing with specific communities, but I feel like there's this innate tension between rulemaking and what may actually end up being an iterative process, and I just wanted to name that.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. Any other thoughts before we move on? All right, well, thank you, Anita, for teeing it up so well for how we're really going to move through the rest of this conversation. And Thea, I think I'm going to pass it to you to provide an update on the Housing Accountability TAC. And just note that you're receiving an update today, but we will later in our RAC meetings be diving deeper into policy direction and decision points and some of the complexities that are being raised in the tax space. So Thea, I'll pass it to you.
That's right. So yeah, this is kind of a teaser, but I wanted to bring you all into what is happening over in the Housing Accountability Technical Advisory Committee. Ethan, you can go to the next slide. Just to sort of resituate all of you in what the sort of scope and the directive is for HOTAC. By January 1st, 2025, we're developing criteria for referral into the Housing Acceleration Program. We're designing an efficient and effective audit of local housing barriers. And we're coordinating a partnership strategy with cities, which includes incentives and, if necessary, enforcement tools to ensure that all cities can come along, can address those barriers to housing production. Senate Bill 1564 actually in the short legislative session added a new component that we will be developing right up until January 1st of 2026, which includes the development of model codes, which are sort of here intended to serve as a potential element of the enforcement program. So that's sort of the very high level directive. Ethan, go on to the next slide. And I think you've all seen this graphic before. We don't need to spend too much time here, but it's sort of a visual map of where we're going and where the TAC is spending time. You'll see sort of in the middle, the Housing Acceleration Program. In the last meeting that we had, which was our sort of second substantive meeting, I'll say, we spent time talking about the referral process, sort of how expansive that referral process will be. Is it broad or is it deep? And so we're just starting to get into some of the alternatives, some of the different ways that we can set this program up. In the next series of meetings, we're going to be talking about what the audit looks like, and then what the Housing Acceleration Agreement will look like. So those are the next two components. When we come back to this group, the RAC, we will sort of have gone through an initial discussion with the TAC on all of those elements, highlighting some of what we're hoping to get back from you all, some of these bigger policy questions, so that the TAC can go and interpret that into sort of the more technical and implementation oriented details. Go ahead to the next slide, Ethan. I want to reground us here in the racial equity framework that Anita just introduced, and talk a little bit about where we see, this work falling, with this intersecting with the racial equity framework. I'll say that, it really intersects in a lot of places, in several places, almost all the places, but most broadly here, I want to point out some specific areas so that the entire policy context of the accountability program or framework is connected to the history of housing discrimination. And that's sort of the impetus for ensuring that cities are producing enough housing, particularly in the affordable range. Accountability here is intended, so like I said, intended to ensure that local governments are taking the actions that are within their power, not only to support the provision of housing, but to really address and correct for that historical inequity and exclusion. A lot of this work that we're doing relies on data. And I think that what we're seeing as we start to dive into this is that there really is a dearth of data, especially especially with regards to underrepresented communities and lesser heard voices. So I think that part of what this work will highlight is the need for increased data, both qualitative and quantitative, and that we really actually anticipate this to be sort of an effective pressure point to spur change in the data environment. But that, you know, it really is pointing out what we don't have right now. Finally, you know, a lot of this work is around measuring and evaluating the outcomes, particularly around equity indicators and the production dashboard, which intend to make this these metrics really transparent so that all Oregonians can be included in this ongoing review and evaluation of progress toward these housing goals. So those are some sort of high level intersections with this racial equity framework that we're working with, and some of the sort of key goals that we're keeping in mind as we're entering this. But again, as Anita said and as Ben said, we really want this to be sort of a co-created process. We're coming from our, you know, positionality, and this is this process is intended to ensure that a lot of other perspectives are brought into that. So we really do want to hear from you about where you see these connections. Go ahead to the next slide, Ethan. I wanted to sort of bring y'all up to date about what we actually talked about in the last meeting. Some of the high level themes from the HOTAC meeting. We spent some time talking about the goals of the work in the TAC and some of the concerns. And so these are just really, you know, basic. We heard that people wanted, were really anticipating and hoping for empirical metrics. They're hoping for achievability, predictability, fairness, and that at the same time there are concerns that, you know, this is difficult stuff to measure, particularly around equity. There's of course some anxiety about what falls within the local responsibility, and we definitely heard that, as well as sort of the complexity of navigating this new housing landscape in Oregon. That's really changing rapidly. So those are, you know, just some very high level themes that emerged from those meetings. We also spent some time talking about sort of, do we want to frame this through an accountability lens or through an outcomes lens? There are pros and cons to both, and we really heard a broad, you know, a sort of like broad range of perspectives on that. On the accountability side, we heard that there's really a need. This whole program grows out of a need to ensure, you know, the fair share, that each city is doing their fair share, and that really holds well-resourced cities accountable, as well as some needed targeted accountability measures for jurisdictions that consistently resist affordability, particularly within their community affordable housing. On the outcome side, we heard that, you know, this could potentially reduce some pressure on jurisdictions. It focuses on results. It focuses on really empirical metrics, and you know, we're taking this sort of all of this needs to be included in this program. So it was a great conversation, and I think that, you know, it's going to be a full spectrum program. There's no simple way to address it. We also spent some time talking about equity themes that sort of fell outside of the conversation that we had introduced around the racial equity framework. Some of those high levels, I just want to call out farm worker housing specifically, that there are unique unmet housing needs that we need to figure out how to measure and report on for farm worker populations. Also a call to measure the concentration of privilege, which needs to be measured in addition to sort of concentration of poverty. And that's a shift in perspective, and that it's equally important to sort of notice those concentrations and how they look across the state. We also heard themes of tenure, home ownership versus renting, and also about the quality, not just the quantity of housing units, but the quality of housing units. So those are all themes that we're going to be returning to. Ethan, go ahead and I'll wrap this up. I just wanted to leave you with some sort of teaser questions for RAC 3 when we come back to this group to do a deep dive on the Housing Accountability Program. What circumstances or factors warrant a referral? Qualitative, quantitative, something to think about. How should the audit process be structured? And that's to, really think through the legislative priorities and direction, and to think about how we put this audit process together in a way that falls within the capacity of both the cities and the state, and can be accomplished consistently. Then how does the audit inform the acceleration agreement? What elements from that audit are included in the agreement? How does that create what the agreement looks like? And finally, sort of what are the parameters around enforcement, and what tools does the state have, and can the state bring to bear to spur communities into action that are truly resistant? So I just want to leave you with those. Those are just some of the many questions that we have. There's more you can dig into, and we're very happy to have a conversation about it. We're looking forward to coming back to this group later this month. But I think that's all I have for now. So I will return it to you, Ben.
Great, thanks, Thea. So I guess I would ask if there's any burning questions for clarity for today, recognizing this is just an update, but don't want to just move on if there's something that's really pulling at you. Okay, well, thanks, Thea. Conan? Similar?
Thank you. Good morning. Buenos dias. Karen Dijen Chapman. I am one of the project team members supporting our Housing Capacity and Urbanization Technical Advisory Committee. I'm going to do a couple reminders about our timeline, which is slightly different, and go into some of the topic areas. And I will share with you all when you will be hearing more specific policy questions that will come back to you. So that's what I'm going to cover today in just a few minutes. And we can go to the next slide. All right, so quick reminder, you will be hearing a lot from the Needs and Production Advisory Committee members today, because those rules will be adopted by January 1st of next year. Note to the left here that when it comes to capacity and urbanization rules and policies, we have until January 2026. So I wanted to note for RAC members that this committee is meeting monthly. You will see some of the other committees have been meeting weekly or bi-weekly to meet their statutory deadline. But the three areas that we'll be covering over the time period outlined here for you are refining the methodologies around local government's buildable lands inventory. So how they're inventorying those lands, and there's a variety of different categories to inventory. There is existing guidance and rules around that. There's a lot of room for assumptions, interpretation, there's room for improving some of those guidelines, providing greater clarity and certainty. So we'll be working through that, as well as coordinating public facilities planning. In this legislative session, we also had a new requirement. We'll bring that to you all, and we're going to be working on that with some of our TAC members around facilities at the local government level and supporting that work. And finally, what you will hear from this committee is around UGB amendments, the analysis work that's done there and the rules that guide that. That includes exchanges, expansions, and the last topic area is around the reserves, both rural and urban reserves, and how we facilitate and support local governments doing that work. What is going to come out of this committee is not solely rules, but in addition, there's a variety of guidance documents that exist around these subjects. Those guidance documents are very outdated. There have been statutes passed that have changed how some of this analysis is done. So the guidance documents have the opportunity to improve on them, but also update them and revise them to at least align with today's current statutes. So I think that is a good overview. I have a little bit more I'm going to delve into. Ethan, we can go to that next slide. Both Anita and Thea have walked through how each TAC is integrating the racial equity framework. Our TAC meeting monthly, we have met once in March, and we began with those categories around historical inequities. We were able to frame up that discussion with what specific mechanisms under the jurisdiction of Oregon Land Use Planning Program can really assist in reducing historical inequities. And you can imagine, as a city inventories its land and then estimates the capacity they have on that land, where a local government decides to put that capacity, what type of capacity they put where. There's a lot of really contextualized examples for how local decision-making really impacts who has choice of where they live and choice of the quality of housing and the type of housing that they need. But at this stage, we're really looking at this question through the lens of the BLI. We will be looking at this question through the lens of facilities planning and the variety of impacts that has. They're numerous, and through the context of UGB amendments and reserves, and the future policies as well. So you'll see us move through a variety of categories. We'll also move through a variety of these questions within each category. So in our first meeting, the second question we honed in on is who will benefit from this action and who will be most burdened. You can imagine benefits around land ownership and tenure, benefits around certain districts or neighborhoods, benefits around economic development, redevelopment potential. There's a lot of really heavy both burdens and benefits that come with how land is designated or zoned. And so we'll be coming back with you to the TAC and as well to you all, the RAC members, on how we're weaving this throughout each discussion and what we're gleaning from that feedback. And when we come to you with specific policy considerations or decision points, we will give an opportunity to hear from you all, RAC members, on how you want to see it integrated, where we're hitting some of those really sticky points, and how we're working through the equity goals that we have. And I did, like Thea, I wanted to let you know a little bit about what we discussed in our first sort of kickoff with the TAC around this policy content. So Ethan, I'm going to go to my last slide and we'll delve into that. So the buildable lands inventory and your capacity analysis is something that a local government will do. They will look at what they have zoned, where it's zoned, what capacity it's zoned at, and they have to do an inventory first of what is actually buildable. So there can be a variety of constraints around buildability, whether that's what is already existing on the site and developed, if the site is developed out, that parcel. Are there natural hazards constraints, or are there natural resources that need to be protected? And then you kind of get into these intricacies of, well, it's partially developed, but there's enough land there that it could have additional development on the land. But how does the partial development impact that? How do I evaluate that if that's in a residential zone versus a mixed use zone? All of this are feedback that we got from our TAC members. And we posed the question, what aspects of this land inventory do you feel have the greatest ambiguity and the largest assumptions? And what we will be working through with our TAC members in the months of May and June is where those assumptions exist and that ambiguity. What do we need to provide flexibility for local government partners to do this inventory? And where are they seeking greater certainty, greater clarity, where we could provide more clear guidance or some safe harbors around assumptions that are made? Later in May and June, we'll move into estimating development capacity and really looking at a variety of different methodologies for what communities can plan for as far as development in their 20-year planning horizon, and then how they're going to inventory their development ready lands within their 6 to 8 year housing capacity analysis timeframe under the ONA statutes. So that gives our RAC members an idea of what we're talking about now, what we're working through in April and May, and what we might be working through towards the end of spring. You're going to hear quite a bit over the next few months from both HATAC, the Housing Accountability, and NAPTAC, the Needs and Production. We will, from CalTAC, from the Capacity and Urbanization Technical Advisory Committee, we will be bringing you these policy discussions probably late summer, fall, and towards the end of the year, because we will continue to work on this through 2025. I'll pause there, Ben, if you want to open it up to any clarifying questions.
Yeah, thank you. So same context, burning, clarifying questions, recognizing we'll have time to dive deeper in future discussions. We'll pause. Okay, thanks, Kyle. So let's keep moving. We're really going to spend the rest of our time together today getting a kickoff from Madi around housing needs and production TAC and some key questions that have emerged through that process that we're going to hone in on in our conversation. So Madi, take it away.
Thank you, Ben. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Madi Valencia Aguilar. I use she or they pronouns, please, and I am a senior housing planner with the department. It's great to hold space with you all today. I am one of 2 staff members that support the Housing Needs and Production Technical Advisory Committee. My other colleague here, and I must give a shout out to, is Celestina Teva. Together, we've been working in the scope that is the realm of NAPTAC. Yeah, as Ben noted, we'll be focusing the attention for the remaining of the time on needs and production and on NAPTAC. And while if you saw the matrix that showed the various meetings for each TAC, it does show that NAPTAC has met more times, but it doesn't necessarily mean we're further along in terms of the content. But we're at a stage where we're able to, lean on your expertise today to help kind of anchor the discussions forward. And so some of you today who are in the needs and production TAC are going to get to dive deeper into the work that will be forthcoming in the next 2 meetings, and I'll go deeper into that in future slides. So with that, Ethan, if I could have you move on to the next slide. Thank you. Quickly, I'm just going to touch briefly, and I'm going to go as quickly as possible so that we can hear from you all, because that's what we're here to do, and that's what we're interested in. So just a quick reminder about what's within the scope of NAPTAC. We've got, earlier you heard some colleagues say that NAPTAC and HATAC have a deadline of January 1st, 2025. That is true for NAPTAC. 2 major topic areas are kind of in the scope of the NAPTAC. The first one being the translation of needed housing into housing types, characteristics, and locations. And then the integration of affirmatively furthering fair housing into the housing production strategy. I'll dig deeper into those in the future slides. Just a quick note on the third topic area. This one is the development of adoption-ready strategies, kind of the really, really, really fun stuff. The other two are fun, but this is really fun. It's tools and resources that could help local governments in kind of the intent behind the ONA policy, which is really on housing production, affordability, and choice. Because these tools and resources don't go into the rule, they can span beyond that January 1st, 2025 deadline, and we'll be digging into that work in the latter half of this year and through next year. If I could go to the next slide. Thank you. So quickly, I just want to kind of touch on the first topic area with some key reminders about just the foundational changes that occurred through the House Bill 2001 or the ONA policy that's basically driving the process or the work that the NAPTAC has to grapple with in terms of needed housing. With the adoption of the ONA policy, this new methodology, we're basically trying to reorient the way that local governments plan for housing around this new methodology and the intent behind it. And so local governments will be receiving a allocation of housing need from the state that is segmented by affordability. And then they have to go into a next kind of step and assess that needed housing based on kind of the changes that were made at the statute level in terms of the needed housing statute. One of the biggest changes there is this broadening definition that now includes a responsibility for local governments to translate their allocation into housing types, characteristics, and locations. The local governments are still, making policy determinations at the local level to plan for housing and accommodate that need through that lens. But what the first topic area that NAPTAC is really grappling with is unpacking that direction of translating types, characteristics, and locations. So with that, that's kind of a high-level overview of the first topic area. If we can move on to the next slide, please. The second topic area is a major kind of milestone that is part of the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Policy, and that is, the integration of fair housing planning into Goal 10. And specifically what that means is now local governments who are undergoing, well, generally all local governments have a responsibility to and are obligated by Goal 10 obligations. Specifically, local governments that are undergoing and developing a housing production strategy, they have a responsibility and a requirement now as part of that work to affirmatively further fair housing. This is exciting work. It's an opportunity to really further the intent of the ONA policy, which is really geared towards, advancing fair and equitable housing outcomes at the local level and throughout our state collectively. And Oregon is the first state to comprehensively integrate fair housing and land use in such a way. So being the first, there is no blueprint, there is no guide for practitioners for how to do that. But that's the exciting and opportunity that NAPTAC gets to grapple with is really bringing this new lens and establishing a process that works for the Oregon context. That is the second topic area. If we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so what has NAPTAC been up to? We've had 3 meetings as of today. We started the work in mid-March on March 13th with the first meeting or first meeting being TAC orientation in 2023, but second meeting, but first meeting of this year on March 13th. We started to focus the discussion first on the first topic area, the needed housing a translation of types, characteristics, and locations. And really, that was a very introductory, exploratory discussion where folks came and offered their feedback about what that meant to them. What's the universe of types? What's the universe of characteristics? And what do we mean in universe of locations? I'll be giving you kind of an update on what feedback we heard in the next few slides. That really is the intent there. In terms of the nexus with the racial equity framework, in the same way that my colleagues Thea and Gaden described the process that they built into their TACs, we also did the same. So in that first meeting, we spotlighted historical inequities, benefits, and burdens, and people really leaned into to offering their feedback through that lens. And so as I go through that feedback, you'll kind of hear that, and definitely keep that in mind as you engage in discussion here shortly. The third meeting, held on March 20th, moved away from that first topic area and focused on the second topic area, so AFFH. And here's in the same way that we kind of approach the first meeting, we approach this one where it's very exploratory, bring your expertise in racial equity and equity in AFFH in Goal 10, and start to offer feedback on what the integration of this work could look like in the Goal 10 planning system, both on the opportunities that we could foresee and the challenges that come to mind. Again, discussion and feedback was through the lens of historical inequities and benefits and burdens, two of those elements that are outlined in the framework. And then the third meeting we've had so far was just last week. And that took us back to the first topic area of needed housing, but diving specifically into housing types. We started to shift kind of the components of the racial equity to spotlight two other elements: data equity and data justice, community engagement and empowerment, because while all these components have kind of a nexus with housing types, these two in particular felt, even further alignment. So a reasoning for us to kind of, uplift those and offer that responsibility to our TAC members to offer their feedback through that lens. So we can go on to the next slide, Ethan. Okay, so quickly, I'm going to offer the feedback that came out of the first meeting that focused on the universe of types, characteristics, and locations, that first focus area. Here is a table of, the breadth of what we heard on the types. Generally, on the left here under the table, you'll see the housing types that TAC members raised that they didn't see included in the needed housing statute. So things like ADUs, tiny homes on wheels, variation of single room occupancy. And I should note SROs are, defined and needed in the needed housing statute. But here they were saying, the variations of those types didn't feel like that was outlined there, and wanted to lift that up. And then mixed use housing types. On the characteristics side, you can see the breadth of various things, attributes that should be considered in this translation included things like bedroom count diversity, multi-generational living, tenure spectrum, and the diversity within and the range within, financeability and all the types and the ranges within. Really a host of varieties of characteristics that came to mind for our TAC members. On the location side, lots of options also, but really at the core, kind of, thinking about high opportunity areas, or, kind of complete communities, mobility, rollable, bikeable, near resources, near services, in close proximity to open space and green space. Emphasizing the need for kind of that complete community under what it means, what they felt meant could be translated out of locations. Okay, so with that, can we go on to the next slide, Ethan, please? Thank you. So the next meeting, the AFFH focused meeting that happened on March, now I forget the date, second week of maybe March 20th. Here, the NAPTAC grappled with opportunities and challenges of AFFH, and we received a host of feedback. Could not put it on this screen. There was so much, but it was great, and they fell within 4 bucket areas. Those 4 bucket areas is exactly what's kind of noted here on this slide. I'll quickly highlight some of the feedback that we heard under each bucket area, but please know that the list expands beyond what I'm noting today. And we'll have kind of a meeting summary on this particular meeting in future meetings for you all to kind of sit, digest all the breadth of feedback. So on the equity and content-oriented side, here we heard a lot of feedback around a need for a collective recognition of housing policies of the past. Things like redlining and racial segregation, single-family residential zoning, restrictive covenants, things of that nature that inform current inequities of today. And kind of a gap in education awareness of that history in present day. Kind of a need to normalize, kind of our history and how that matters in policy, in the housing space, and in planning today. And also noted kind of because of that history and because of that gap in awareness, possibly contributing to the major resistance that folks feel on the ground when things like affordable housing or attempts to advance fair and equitable outcomes locally are kind of being operationalized. In this topic area, we also heard, kind of the same feedback that, Thea noted in her segment about a need to consider various tenure types and affordability types that go beyond just rental options, and how AFFH, is really there to kind of support that type of thinking. And lastly, interestingly enough, we heard some support, a lot of support around kind of this identification of a missing element of the housing production strategy that could help equitable outcomes, that includes a geographic analysis. This felt like it could help local governments move towards better understanding the placement of housing near kind of opportunity areas, where people really are and how and who gets to benefit and not. So that was very interesting that I wanted to note. Moving on to the next topic area, process-oriented. Here in this bucket, again, lots of ideas that we heard, but really, I'll note some. There was interest by the NAPTAC members for an opportunity for interagency collaboration for the integration of AFFH into Goal 10. Some folks felt and raised a possible tension between the production targets that local governments will have and, equity goals and outcomes and, what's the right balance. Others, raised the importance of data, not just numeric or quantitative, but really qualitative, noting that the numbers, and we heard this loud and clear from, Thea and her kind of update too, this kind of understanding that, we're not getting the full picture through that quantitative analysis, but how can we, folks in the NAPTAC offered suggestions about, how qualitative data or engagement can really support kind of understanding that better picture. And that is part of the housing production strategy program right now. But there was a note from members in the group that wanted to flag how this is really hard work, developing an engagement program that is responsive, both culturally and inclusively, and lifting up voices that are typically not at the table or have historically been disenfranchised, how to do that in a meaningful way, even if it's done right, how it can still cause harm. So a lot of that was kind of feedback that came out of that lens that from tied to the equity framework. And then there were so moving on to the next section here is some feedback around goals 12 and goal 9, and just considering, housing with those intersections. And then lastly, on the last bucket area is actions and strategies. Lots of folks offered feedback around solutions and options and tools, and that really is what is encompassed within that area. I'm going to move us to the next slide, if you can. Thank you, Ethan. On the next slide here, this discussion focused on housing types, as I noted earlier, and 3 major themes rose to the top. The first one being, this complex relationship between housing types and affordability, and how affordability in housing influences various factors beyond just the type of housing. There was feedback around the right balance between safety and accessibility with housing types, kind of normalizing smaller temporary housing types for lending and safety reasons, and also ensuring safety, so it's to not restrict these forms of housing in an effective long-term manner. Lastly, other members kind of lifted up attention in zoning policies and their critical role in kind of making the determination of types of housing that can be built on the ground. So I am there a lot that is at the highest level, kind of the major feedback that came out of that discussion. So we can go on to the next slide. Before I turn it over to Ben to kind of facilitate the discussion, this is my last slide here. I wanted to leave you with kind of a look ahead as to where we're going. So as I just mentioned, we're very introductory, very exploratory, and we kind of dug deep into housing types. Next week, we start back up in the NAPTAC, and we're going to dig deep in April to further unpack characteristics and locations, which are the 2 elements that aren't as straightforward as housing types as outlined in the needed housing statute. So today, we are leaning on your expertise to kind of get ahead of those discussions by prompting these questions specifically focused on characteristics and locations to kind of anchor and orient those NAPTAC in the weeds discussions using your expertise. So keep that in mind, that's kind of why we've built these discussion questions that are focused on these 2 particular elements that the NAPTAC is grappling with. There's also, as they dig deep into the characteristics and locations in the next couple of weeks, they will be overlaying that with affirmatively furthering fair housing. So please do also bring that AFFH lens today as you kind of grapple with the questions that they'll be grappling with in the next couple of weeks. So that's April, digging deep into those two elements, and then in May we're going to do the hard work of kind of the how, right? How can local governments really make that translation determination? How will local governments, as part of their HPS process, affirmatively further fair housing beyond what's currently being kind of addressed in that HPS program? And other various dimensions of how that come up as we're kind of engaging in these discussions. So with that, I think I am going to yield it back to you, Ben, and I'm excited to hear from all of you as we engage in discussion.
Great, thanks, Monty. Why don't we preview the questions, and then just before we get into the discussion. So you can start seeing at least the first three questions that we'll start with. And then we have one more that we'll also get into. So I'm just going to ask, a couple things before we have the conversation. That one, you just reflect back to the ground rules that you hold our equity framework considerations close, and really thinking about how folks are taking up space. So because of the size of the group and the structure of these questions, I'm just going to ask make a couple of requests of folks. So one is that, focus in on questions in a way that really best aligns with your areas of interest and expertise, knowing that we have a real range around the room. And as I said earlier, we also do have Anita here that can help provide some expertise and help prompt questions that ensure that kind of all the different areas of interest and expertise around the table have avenues to bring your voice into the conversation. I'll also just ask, again, because we have a lot of folks in the room, that if you've heard someone raise something you agree with, there are reactions. You can do a thumbs up or a heart, something. What I'll ask is just not to repeat what someone said. If you want to build upon it, please do. But there's lots of ways to show agreement, and we will capture the essence of that agreement in different mechanisms. Just want to make sure we're not hearing the same thing over and over again. So I'll just ask those requests, rely on you all to use your best judgment. So with that, I'm going to open it up. So we have 4 total questions. We're at 10:30. We want to build in a break. We got, about an hour and 15 or so to move through these. So probably about 15 to 20 minutes that we can allocate for each one, but I'll allow the kind of conversation to guide where we go. So why don't we start with this first question around how do local governments actually plan for affordability? And I think as you're thinking about that, really, planning for the type of options and locations that reflect affordability. And let's just open it up. So what's resonating for folks when you think about how governments are planning for affordability? Kara.
Yes, good morning, everybody. I apologize for being off screen this morning. I'm a little under the weather. I think, what I could add, speaking for the city of Gresham and what we have been doing and look to more proactively do, is since we don't develop affordable housing, we have relationships with the entities that do and are in active discussion with them on where are the attractive sites? Where are the attractive locations? What makes sense for them and what makes sense for the city and the various communities within the city? And then ensuring that those sites and locations have zoning that's appropriate for their affordable housing developments that will pencil out, and then ensuring that we have whatever sort of funding and incentives that we can offer to support them, whether that's use of the Metro Affordable Housing Bond dollars or urban renewal dollars, etc. So I think it's really a cooperative process if you're looking to be proactive about facilitating affordable housing types.
Great, thank you for that. Tara, Miranda.
Yeah, I would add on to that we look for strategies where we own land, to use that as an opportunity to provide subsidized affordable housing and attract developers to work with us to provide that housing. We don't have a lot of land in our city, but so one of the strategies that we've been looking at is how to land bank and how to potentially attract folks to land bank in our urban reserves, where we know that land will hopefully be coming into the urban growth boundary. That's one of the hardest areas to provide affordable housing. And we really want to try to integrate affordable housing in every community. We were able to luckily do that out in Villebois because of the land had been owned by the state. And so it's a strategy that we'd like to continue in the future. Another thing that we're trying to do, and it's not directly related to subsidized housing, but we all know that people will buy what housing is available. And so one of the things that we employ heavily and are continuing to do is to zone for a wide range of housing, but also establish variety requirements. And so it's hopefully going to establish a requirement to provide a variety of different housing types, both of different sizes and styles of housing, And then also looking at a certain percentage of built housing to require the ability to be mobility friendly. So those are things that we're looking at, which don't necessarily specifically get to affordability because some of those things could be in affordable units and some not. But hopefully, by providing a much wider variety of supply, inevitably you will hopefully get this more diverse housing prices that we're not seeing today.
Great, thanks.
Could I just ask one follow-up question?
Yes, Christina.
Thanks, Ben. Hey, Miranda, thank you so much. I would love to hear just for a moment a little bit more about the variety requirement and if that's something that you all are. I didn't hear quite if you've already got that going or if you're planning on it, but if that's for concept planning or area planning across it, where you can maybe have a little bit more influence around a mix or if that's more even in infill or just a little bit more about what you're working with there.
Yeah, that is more for our area-wide planning in our new urban growth boundary area. So we did that in Villebois but it was more prescriptive. It was like on these lots, we want this, and it provided that diversity both in location, but across the whole area. And it was more prescriptive. It was like, here's where the large lots will be. Here's where the small lots will be. Here's like how the multifamily will interface with the townhouses and the townhouses with the single, like we kind of had these types. It was like this very colorful map. And it resulted in a wide variety of housing types and a good mix of housing units. With the changes that have occurred, now it's instead, which I think will actually be interesting, is more about percentages. So essentially not requiring more than a certain percentage of the land to be taken up by any single housing type, which we envision from the market would predominantly be single family detached. And so we're essentially setting a maximum. We are then requiring a certain percentage of middle housing, requiring a certain amount of a third housing type. And that is essentially to hope incentivize smaller unit types, because that's not typically what the market wants. And that ends up kind of being in that third bucket. The third bucket ends up being like ADUs, homes of any type that are under a certain square footage. Trying to remember how else multifamily. And so they can kind of pick and choose. So it provides that freedom to the market, but it's also essentially pushing the market to say you have to provide a variety so that we ensure in this area we're not just allowing everything everywhere and then end up getting all the same thing everywhere, but that we actually end up getting that diversity of housing type. In our infill areas, we're not doing that because in the infill areas, what we're hoping is that that's already built out to some extent. And that when we get the infill, most of the time you see additional density just because of cost of land. And so we're not, we don't have those requirements yet. I think one thing we might think about is less about the types and the variety of types and more about the characteristics, like things like accessibility or mobility friendly. That might be something we translate over. This is the first time we'll do that in our new urban area planning area. And we want to see kind of how that might translate citywide after the fact.
Thanks, Miranda.
Yeah, thanks for that follow-up. Let's go Shane, Kelly, then Kathleen.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I just wanted to definitely add, my name's Shane. She or they pronouns are great. Just a housing advocate, mostly in the Portland metro region. Something that I would definitely recommend when I was hearing Miranda, I believe, talk about the variety of housing types, the proportional percentages that you have for a land region. So single family, missing middle housing, and then other proportionate. Something I always think about is that if from the 1950s to now, if 1 out of every 4 single family lots were a fourplex, then we may very well not have been the housing situation that we're in. And when it comes to thinking about the variety of housing types or what the market wants, sometimes there's much more of a relationship of what the market wants, and because it's just what's available. It's the MO, it's the language that people understand, and that's single family topology. And a lot of people my age, say 40s and under, we really envision homeownership to be cooperative housing. It doesn't have to be that 6-bedroom single family model. People are thinking fundamentally differently, I feel, in the types of homeownership mixed with meeting density, getting more units per square footage of land, so you have more of a tax base. I just think, and then thinking about ecological design, we just have to really invite that the younger generations only are seeking single family right now if they can qualify for housing, because that's simply what's been available in the topology. And it really usher us to question what is the want for the current market versus the desired need that is building, especially for people under the age of 35.
Yeah, thank you, Shane. Let's go Kelly, then Kathleen.
So for our city, we've done a couple of things. Number one, we're trying to integrate affordable units within development. So we incentivize density bonuses in apartment development where you can increase density by providing affordable units and get zoning benefits with setbacks and parking reductions and height increases and so on. To then provide additional units for affordable restricted units to help integrate it within an existing development to help decrease costs. We're also looking at trying to provide different types of affordable housing options rather than just the traditional large apartment type development. Through the housing production strategy, we're trying to do innovative styles like tiny homes on wheels, small single family home lots, because we do still have a lot of people, especially in rural communities, that want to buy single family homes but can't afford the larger lots. So we're still trying to provide those opportunities. Cottage clusters, implementing the workforce housing that is still an affordable option. So it's increasing the amount of housing types that can become affordable and just expanding the opportunities outside of what has been the traditional zoning over the last 100 years. Is a major focus. The other thing that our city has done is we've really tried to negate the NIMBYism concept. Our decision criteria is pretty black and white. It's, do you meet the development code, yes or no? And if you do, then your project is pretty much guaranteed to be approved. We still have the public input process, which then helps guide us through the decision-making process for long-term planning goals, but it doesn't stop a project from moving forward as long as it meets the code. So as trying to remove NIMBYism from the equation, it helps to encourage affordable housing development and regular housing development to come into the city as well.
All right, thank you, Kelly. Let's go Kathleen, then Mac, then Brock.
I think one of the things that would help on affordability is to get jurisdictions a list of the kinds of resources that are available, what is available in the way of tax credits, what resources can the city put in, what's coming from the feds in terms of vouchers, so that there are resources that the city is aware of in order to develop this affordable housing, because there's got to be money to make it affordable. And I think that's a needed piece.
Great, thank you, Kathleen. Mac, and then Brock.
Yeah, thank you. I want to say big ups again to what just Kathleen mentioned about the meeting the need for affordable housing is going to require on some level of public subsidy. And to back up a little bit, I'm an affordable housing developer for a community housing development organization within the Portland metro region. And to reach those lower AMI levels, it's impossible due to underwriting requirements without additional public subsidy there. So I really appreciate that. I also want to highlight and appreciate Shane's comment about the single family home and folks from younger generations, and the comment around market demand for single family homes being that is kind of what is the collective imagination, because that's all we've heard or seen. And within that, also kind of want to highlight that the single family home in an urban environment is relatively a new experiment, if you will, from the 1950s on. Like, they did exist before, but the reliance and exclusivity of that is really new. And I know that this is something we'll talk about more, but that is really rooted in racial segregation and trying to push out lower income folks who are disproportionately people of color. But also it's built on a heteronormative sort of model as well. It was really assumed that there would be a husband who would be bringing in an income and then a wife staying at home to take care of children and maintain the home. And that's not really the world we live in. I think we can all agree anymore. That is not how most households are. Most households are dual income. If there are two parents with children there. And so precipitating like most of our housing system on that, I think has been obviously resulted in this affordability crisis, and it's not something we should heavily rely on in the future. Backing up a little bit to this more specific question though, as well, I just wanted to chime in, at least from my end of the table, what I see that can really help plan for and ensure affordability that local governments can do is planning for that variety of zones that can accommodate different housing types across the housing spectrum, particularly higher density ones, and making sure that those locations of high density zoning are located near job centers, area of opportunity, amenity rich areas. And then back to the public sort of dollar aspect of what can help make those affordable housing projects pencil. It's really like incentive packages, whether that be public subsidy directly through like a bond or what have you, but also property tax waivers. That's really important for an operational side to make sure that we can carry the debt as far as a bank is concerned. SDC waivers as well to reduce permitting costs, permit fee waivers within that as well. Density bonuses can really help both to increase the number of units that could be on site to reach the necessary economy of scale, but also some flexibility within the FAR and the floor area ratio, the setbacks and whatnot to make sure that those sites can truly be developable at those higher densities. And then finally, I want to say a big up to land banking. Land banking is a really important strategy to make sure that we are guaranteeing that affordable housing can be provided in all communities, especially as tied with fast transit projects to make sure that the folks who disproportionately use transit will have access to that transit once it's built. And that's it for now. Thank you.
That's it for now. Thanks, Mac. You covered a lot of ground there, which I appreciate. Anita, did you want to jump in, add some context or reflection?
Oh, sure. I just wanted to prompt some of the folks that are affordable housing advocates. I think, Mac, that was really great to talk about it and what Shane said. I know there's other folks on the rack. What sort of recommendations would you want to give to local governments about what affordability means to you? There's all this technical stuff, which is important on the back end, but what are some of the things that you know about people that you work with or you represent or yourself that are challenges for affordability into getting into units? I know there's quite a few of those, so prompting those and putting some space out for those of you to share. It'd be really great for folks to hear.
Yeah, thank you, Anita. So let's go Brock and Miranda, and then I'm going to pick up on where Anita was going and really bring some of the advocates in to reflect on that question around what does affordability mean to you, some of the challenges of finding that's the way or accessing affordable housing. So Brock, jump in.
I'm going to build on Wilsonville's earlier comment a little bit and touch on what Anita just said as well. I do actually live in the Villa Blanc neighborhood. My wife and I have an apartment there. The neighborhood itself has an AMI that is, I think, 25 to 30,000 higher than the rest of the city on average. My wife and I do not make AMI for the neighborhood, but we do roughly for the city. But the check that we write to our landlord every month for like rent and utilities combined comes out to about $2,300 a month. It is a great place. It's a wonderful area to live. We love the neighborhood, but it is not very affordable. And we live in arguably the most affordable type that's there. It's a 3-story apartment, so we're not running into prevailing wage issues either. So I think it's really important to, yes, make sure that we're having different types of housing in our neighborhoods, but the more and more prescriptive we become with that, the more and more expensive it can be. I cannot imagine making less than we do and still being able to afford the apartment that we live in. And it's not, a massive apartment by any means. It's slightly larger than what cities are asked to plan for in their climate friendly areas of 900 square feet. So there is a substantial tie to affordability as we're talking about the complexity of what gets developed and the prescriptive nature of how those plans are made.
Sure. Thank you, Brock. Miranda, Shannon, and then Corey.
Sure, I would just quickly make a plug right now based on what Brock just said, is that we saw a 50% jump in our rental prices in the last like 2 to 3 years. Prior to that, we actually were not within the severely rent burdened in the city. And one thing I would say is that we need to figure out the finance market, because multifamily residential, we have 3 approved projects and none of them can get financing. And so part of the issue we're seeing is that we don't have enough multifamily residential projects coming online right now. So that's just one thing. And then I did want to support Shane. I wanted to add that we are actually pushing developers substantially. Right now, we're receiving a lot of pushback for us wanting to require variety. We're actually not setting a minimum for single family detached. We're just setting a maximum. And we're proposing to remove minimum lot size so that that's just an arbitrary number that people come up with. And we want to provide flexibility for the types of housing units that we want to see built, and that they won't have lot size constraining them. So I actually think that's a thing that more cities could do. What I would actually like to push for as a part of this conversation as well is to see greater transparency from developers, and particularly for market developers, to be mandated by the state to mirror kind of some of the expectations that we're seeing on the public side of things. And help to push expectations for them to provide variety as well, because I agree the market is this thing that people want to talk about, and what is the market. And we see a lot of developers, especially the ones out established in the suburbs, who truly have kind of done one style of development over time and truly believe that there is only a market of financial feasibility to build primarily single family detached with some townhomes and multifamily. But local governments would really value from having data and support to push further on that creativity with developers, and to truly understand what pencils are not, and then be able to work together to solve that specific question, rather than pushing cities to reduce our own desire to provide variety and accessibility and all of these other features in housing we know is needed in our community.
Thanks, Miranda. Let's go Shannon, then Corey, Alan, and then we'll see if any other hands come up, and then Garrett, and then we'll move to the next question. Shannon.
Shannon Billhauer, she, her pronouns. I work with Habitat for Humanity of Oregon. I wanted to highlight that of the 24 local habitats building and repairing homes across the state, 22 are based in rural Oregon communities, and that the average median income we serve with affordable home ownership is 46% of AMI around the state, and we have a greater than 98% mortgage payoff rate. So what's working? What do we see that's working great, that we appreciate and love? One thing is just townhomes, right? Having townhomes in communities of all sizes is so helpful. It sounds kind of basic, but I mean very small communities as well as larger communities. Sometimes, like in La Pine, for example, the Habitat affiliate board actually advocated to get townhomes into the code for the first time within the last 6 years. Infrastructure, flexibility, and support. I called out in the NAPTAC itself the great work that LeGrand has done to really make it possible to get infrastructure in for a affordable homeownership developer of lesser means, so that we pay off some of that infrastructure at time of home sale. That's a game changer for us. That's actually a game changer for a minimally resourced developer in a rural community, and as well as really progressive code that's going to allow for siting of shared wall modular homes that are 1 and 2 bedroom. And as I shared in the NAPTAC, a site where we previously thought we could get 5 homes, it's looking like as many, it sounds amazing, but as many as 15. And that's going to be a partnership between us, a for-profit builder building modular homes in the area, and very actively, right, the city of LeGrand and other community partners. Also similarly in Sisters, Oregon, we are seeing great work with modular housing up to 120% AMI. This kind of public, nonprofit, public, and for-profit builder partnership, right, coming together to super affordably get highly sought after in prime location units on the ground. Another practice that just really benefits our network that I want to call out. Sisters, for a long time, whenever a single family builder asks for a variance, which is almost always to build something like 40 homes, Sisters have said, you know, what we're going to need is for a certain number of these homes to serve lower income members of our community. If you want that variance, which you say you need. And it's worked. It's worked for apartments, it's worked for home ownership, and just the impacts are incredible. So we really, really, really appreciate and want to uplift that strategy. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Shannon. Let's go Corey Allen.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Great comments. I just wanted to shine a light. I really felt that the complete communities framework that came up in some of the TAC work is a really important one, and I think a really helpful framework to think about moving forward, because I think when we use that as the way that we're trying to achieve multiple goals here, I think it's a really great way for getting at the housing outcomes we want, but also some of these equitable outcomes that we want to see, because I think, as other folks have mentioned, when folks have housing that is closer to where they work, where they live, where their daycare is, they can meet some of their needs without always having to rely on a car. We're really talking about affordable living. And so I think that can be a really helpful kind of framework to use to step into these conversations, particularly around location, because a lot of cities have already thought about and have plans about where they want more density, where they want more bikeability, walkability, rollability. And so being able to kind of hone in on some of those locations, I think, could be a good strategy for reaching multiple outcomes. And then I think, in terms of really making sure these affordable units get built, it's all about reducing risk, reducing costs, and or reducing delay in time. And so when cities are putting their housing production strategies, right, they need to be thinking about each of those elements and what do they have in play that's tackling those issues that is really going to help close the margin on projects and actually get them to pencil. As we've heard from some practitioners, just having projects pencil and move forward is a huge issue. And so I think, for example, using a TIF, right, and having that in a certain location, right, and you're building public infrastructure with that TIF money, you're closing the margin and helping other housing projects, mixed-use projects get built that otherwise wouldn't be able to, by kind of closing the margin on that cost for projects. So I think those are all things to kind of think about in tandem. Yeah, and I'll go ahead and leave it there.
Thank
Thanks.
you, Alan, please.
Yeah. I would add to the conversation.
Thank you. I want to add to the housing types conversation.
And point out that single homes are 60% of the house stock.
And I wanted to point out that 60% homes are, single family homes are 60% of the housing stock.
But that's not covered by
But those are largely not covered by accessibility regulations. Similarly, townhomes have less accessibility regulations as well.
I think that's something we need to consider if we're looking to achieve both accessible and production costs.
So I think those are some things to consider if we're looking to achieve accessibility in production strategies and goals.
But what other thing I want to make?
There's one other thing I want to mention.
Affordability.
In terms of affordability.
And that's a lot of more disability employment discrimination.
And that is that a lot of people with disabilities face employment discrimination. and then limited employment options.
And that often limits us to 30% or less.
Which will limit us to 30% or less AMI. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. And Garrett, Brian, Ann, I'm gonna move us to the next question, but feel free to kind of build off. And I think Alan, in some ways, teed us up to this second question around government's planning specifically for housing with particular characteristics. And Marty had showed some of the examples that came up in the TAC around the number of bedrooms, multi-generational, to Alan's point, accessibility, visibility, and access for our communities with disabilities, the social connections, tenure, affordability, right? All of these different things that have also been woven through some of your conversations. So I do want us to kind of jump into that space, but so Garrett, if you want to, and Ann, and then Alyssa, if you want to move us both to previous, and then if you have any thoughts on this next question as well.
Sure, thanks, Ben. And I'm going to be probably the lone voice so far for the private development side, but when it comes to planning, it's just been my observation that it's easy to make good plans, and the real trick is trying to get those plans implemented over time. And I would really encourage local governments, especially since we've just been through COVID, and I think COVID is a very important touchstone that we need to look at when we are doing this planning work now, because when I went to planning school, everybody was talking about the exact same things we're talking about now, which is complete communities, high density housing, outdoor options for people to live, smaller housing, that sort of thing. And when COVID hit, all of those plans, which were, I think, fairly well made, were out the window because nobody wanted instantly, nobody that had the ability to move to different places wanted that type of housing. And so what that means is that when it comes to private for-profit development, what you need to do if you're a local government, in my view, is say, all right, we want to hire, we want more diversity in housing type. And how are we going to achieve that in such a way that we can be flexible to things that change from time to time? And I'm thinking about climate resiliency and whatever might happen that we can't see coming. But I really think it's important to clarify that housing is built to the demand. And my experience with my developer clients is that if there's a good demand for high density, smaller housing, they will build that. There is no naturally inbuilt prejudice on the part of the private development side to build only single family. So one of the things that I would recommend that we do that hasn't been done in the past, typically local governments go out and they zone things for certain densities and certain sizes of homes. One of the things that local governments can do is look at its cost barriers and regulatory barriers to building the types of housing that they want to see built. Because if you can, let's say you can get a certain amount of profit off of a given unit, and if the local government has, for example, a substantially lighter fee structure for that type of unit, and that can make up the difference in helping it pencil, I think you will get a lot of developers wanting to do types of housing that is perceived not typical of private development. Because I know a lot of my developer clients really do want to build higher density housing. They are doing a lot of that right now. But sometimes you can't make those pencil because there's not an adequate market for them when they want to sell those homes. The other thing I would mention is that interest rates have a lot to do with this. And so you got to pay attention to the economics when you're dealing with a regulatory structure and say, all right, if we're not seeing developers build enough of what we want, what can we do in terms of lowering the costs of compliance with regulation and lowering the absolute cost of getting the permits for that housing? Those are things that I think more than anything really can tilt the balance between something that the developer is used to doing and knows it can make money off of versus something that's a little more speculative. So I just wanted to raise that as a concern and sort of represent my client base, because I do think that there's a misperception that all they want to do is build single family. I've never found that to be true.
Good, thanks. Okay, let's go. Anne, Lisa, Julia.
Thank you. Getting to both questions, I think I'm hearing a lot about the desire for affordable housing and regulated affordable housing near amenities, which we've worked for a long time. But one thing that we found when we were working on a flexible design option for regulated affordable housing, which is now in our code, is that the requirement in our mixed use areas for ground floor commercial is a really big obstacle to getting affordable housing. For one thing, there's so much less demand for brick and mortar retail nowadays. It's really difficult to attract and retain a commercial tenant beneath. And even before you get that far, the BOLI wage requirement for the commercial segment of the building is extremely expensive, prohibitive to a lot of regulated affordable housing developers. And I am not one, so if there's someone here that can correct that, feel free. But what we're looking at is why do we need to have commercial on the ground floor of every residential building that might be in a mixed use area? Why can't we think about this like horizontal mixed use? When you walk down a vibrant street in a downtown area, you don't see that every building has commercial downstairs and residential upstairs. It can be a horizontal mix that serves the community just as well. We can also think about where we're requiring commercial on the ground floor. Can it just be a non-residential use, a community use? Can we allow some residential on that ground floor, if not all residential on that ground floor? It can provide better accessibility. So that's a good bit about better obtaining regulated affordable housing within these vibrant areas with services and amenities that we're looking toward. And then the other thing I wanted to speak to was I appreciated the notes that were sent to us and this discussion about different needed housing types that might not just be limited to one kitchen. I think we're all kind of used to seeing something that starts looking like a second kitchen as an, oh no, it's going to be an ADU. But we have, what's the problem really with that when we have people who have cultural needs for a second kitchen? We have people who may have disabilities, who might want to live in a household with extended family who can benefit from a second kitchen or a kitchenette or, some sort of food prep area that allows them independence. We have older aging relatives who could use that. I think we need to start getting more comfortable with the idea of a second kitchen or kitchen-ish kind of thing. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thanks, Anne. Let's go, Elisa, and then Julia, and then I'm going to ask that we take a break, and then we'll combine questions 2 and 3 as we move forward. But Shannon, I'll have you first in the queue when we come back. Elisa?
Thank you. I actually do kind of want to speak more to the question 2 about specific characteristics, but and I really wanted to speak up for sort of the non-urban areas and speak more towards some of what we experience on the coast as a tourist-based recreational community, where we see most of the single-family homes that would be produced in that area typically end up being either second homes, vacation rentals, short-term rentals, and so they don't end up being part of the supply for local residents. And especially on Anita's point, in terms of what does affordability mean and what Max spoke about in terms of sort of the need for subsidy. One of the things I think that we want to do is sort of make the connection between the moving folks out of homelessness and into permanent housing and the subsidy that's needed there. So, being able to think about how do you plan for permanent supportive housing that has, necessary subsidy, a linkage to social services, a specific building type that meets the needs of folks that may have disabilities or other needs. And so we want to be able to figure out how to plan for permanent supportive housing in a community and recognize that there is a continuum of getting people into a home of any kind. Similarly, we have a problem in tourist communities in terms of housing for our workforce. Again, there's just a supply issue. We're also extremely land constrained in these tourist communities, right? We have natural resources that bring people here. And so one of the things that I think is a useful tool for local governments in planning for specific types of housing is what we do is partnering with employers. So for example, we struggle to find healthcare workers on the coast because there's no place for them to live. And so being able to really be intentional about working with a healthcare institution, with a social service agency. We work with large employers. We have the Coast Guard here in Astoria, and it's very difficult for folks who are spending short time in the Coast Guard or whose family might be here for 3 to 5 years to find a place to live. And so not wanting to just think about design as the only way we plan for specific types of housing, but also think of the populations that we're trying to serve, whether it's workers, whether it's people with additional needs, and also just recognizing that in communities like recreational communities, there's just not usually a lot of land to work with, and so you have to be extremely efficient with the land you do have to protect the natural resources. So I just wanted to bring up those points.
That's great. Thanks, Alyssa. And I think that's, part of what we'll get to in the third question as well, is just that relationship between identified need in community and what you're actually planning for, and then ultimately what you're actually producing. So that's a good segue into that. Julia, let's go to you, and then I'm going to have us take a break, and then we'll come back, finish kind of questions 2 and 3, and then move into our last question. But Julia, jump in.
I just quickly want to echo a little bit of what Alyssa was just saying, and want to continue to encourage us to have kind of a people first lens as we're talking about this. It's really easy to get caught up in kind of unit counts and types and all that and forget the people that are on the other side. So I appreciate Alyssa kind of framing it in that way. And also just want to layer in one more piece of that, the who are we serving service dollars, especially for folks in PSH, but also just in general, I think is a really important thing to think about. Not necessarily directly related to the built environment conversations we're having, but it still plays such an important piece in making sure there's this holistic solution and recognition of what the need is. But back to question number 2. So I just kind of wanted to acknowledge that certain characteristics are hard to regulate or require via land use code. So things like even accessibility and visitability, there are some limitations within that. And so just thinking through ways that can be integrated into the realm of land use. So things like building in FAR bonuses or lot coverage allowances for accessibility by way of kind of acknowledging that those take up more square footage. So kind of thinking through those balance points. I've also been really excited to see, as I've been looking through a lot of the latest HPSs that have been recently adopted, that there have been some ideas around pre-approved plans, similar to what we've seen historically for ADUs, but now kind of shifting that concept to accessibility and visitability with an attempt to kind of speed up the review process for those on the permitting side, but also by way of having pre-approved plans, cutting costs for those types of units too. So I just love that concept, kind of wanted to bring those into that space, into this space as a tool that I think would be great to continue to explore.
Awesome, thank you. And thanks for going to that next place of ideas and recommendations for what it could look like. So we're at 11:06. Folks good, taking a 10-minute break. And then we'll continue. If there's any additional comments on question 2, get into question 3, which is really that relationship between identified community need and what's being planned for and ultimately produced. And then we'll move into our 4th question, which is really how do local governments show they plan for housing in the locations that their community needs. And I know y'all have already kind of named some of that piece. So let's, it's 11:06, let's come back at 11:16 and we'll continue the conversation. Thanks. All right, we're at 11:16. I was like, how many emails can I respond to in 10 minutes? Well, also walking around and getting a little bit of human break from the screen. So welcome back. So if can we let's Ellen, can we repost the questions in the chat? I want to move us. We got about 30 or so minutes to move through kind of any finishing comments on question 2, and then really get into the final 2 questions around how can local governments show they plan for the characteristics, including affordability, that respond to community needs? So that relationship between characteristic and need, and then the relationship, how can governments show they plan for housing in the locations that their community needs? So really this demonstration of characteristics in need and location in need. And I know you all have been already kind of stepping into that conversation a bit, but that's how we'll move through the rest of our time. So Shannon, as promised, I'll start with you and then we'll go to Brian and then Mac again.
Thanks. I will attempt to be very quick. Picking up on an earlier theme, the way that mixed use is triggering prevailing wage is really challenging, especially when sometimes we're trying to do amazing needed responsive things like provide childcare on that ground floor. So that's something to maybe try to address together. But really getting right to this last question just posed, I really want to call out this importance of mapping who's getting to live where in communities today and having a mapped strategy to ensure broad access to high opportunity areas and to make sure that we're being thoughtful about enhancing assets in areas that have traditionally been more affordable to the extent that we can, because it's hard, right, without displacement. So just wanted to highlight that aspect of things. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go Brian and then Mac, and then I'm going to do some channeling of Anita and push some folks to enter the conversation particularly around this relationship of need and location, building off kind of what Shannon was just describing, right? What does it look like to have choice, right? What are some of the barriers that folks experience, and giving some life to that question. Brian, jump in, please.
Yeah, I want to hopefully do a quick retrospective on the questions, very full queue, and good comments. So on the planning around price, I think just historically cities haven't planned around price. I think that's why why we're here today talking about this. Cities plan around type, typically, inside current city limits. And planning around type is affordability is much more difficult. And I think it starts to push some of the legal limits of what would be allowed if we're really, really proactive about affordability. I wouldn't want to draw a kind of a distinction, though, between what's happening inside a current city limit and then areas you add to an urban growth boundary, because the city of Bend has had success in requiring degrees of affordability in new UGB expansion areas. Difficult to impose that inside a current city, easier in a UGB expansion area. And so we have mandated certain mixes and percentages of affordable housing, but it wasn't a mandate, it was a voluntary agreement formed through the process of being included in the urban growth boundary. On the specific characteristics, again, cities typically don't specify those characteristics. I think it could be done, but the question is around takings. So can we avoid a takings claim by specifying more characteristics? I think it's a great idea. The question is, do we have the legal tools to do that? And then in terms of locations, I think it's great and we should be able to do that, but we would tend to rely on the same tools that cities have used, where you're zoning and creating zones and you're regulating by type rather than affordability. So I think we're kind of back into that same kind of issue or conundrum where type does not equal affordability, especially in areas with high demand and high housing prices. So I think we're kind of limited in the tools that cities have at their disposal to regulate by price. But here we are, so let's figure it out and see what we can do. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. And I imagine some chewy topics for the TAC to dive into. Mac?
Thank you. Yeah, I want to address both of the questions that are being posed. I'll start with the characteristics one first. And in terms of like ensuring that jurisdictions can see like hopefully more accessible and visible housing as well as more family-sized units, I want to call out and give big ups to what Julia was talking about and allowing and recognizing that those types of housing take up more space, and therefore we will need more allowances, allowing more bonuses in those lot coverage allowances, floor area ratio, height, and reduced setback requirements for those different housing types, or yeah, because they'll just take up more space. And then I also want to call out the need for like more clear and objective by right standards for housing developments to make sure that they are more predictable and feasible to develop those types of units. And for jurisdictions to see those desired outcomes, at least in the affordable housing space, the more uncertainty and less unpredictability we have can kill projects, because we, at least in this sort of the nonprofit housing development space, we're relatively small organizations. And so the risk within real estate development already is very high, but it's even higher for nonprofit affordable housing developers, because we don't want to just go through a huge development process, get really close to the end, be $1 to $2 million in pre-development funding out, and then end up not having a project pencil. So having that clear, objective standards or more by right developments is really critical there. And I want to also give big ups to, I think Garrett's comment before about wanting to decrease and remove those regulatory and implicit fiscal barriers to the desired housing types, whether that be, system development charges disproportionately outweighed for multifamily or plan review fees. Obviously, those projects are bigger, but if jurisdictions want to see those, we should help remove some of those barriers that are within a jurisdiction's control. And then the last comment for this question, at least, I want to shout out again what Shannon was talking about, the challenges with BOLI, and share that those same challenges for mixed use developments and BOLI wage requirements also exist for single room occupancy developments, which we know can provide some of the most affordable type of housing out there. Those developments are automatically qualified, no matter the floor count, as a commercial prevailing wage building. So that's that. And then in terms of locations, for how local governments can show they plan for housing in locations that their community needs, I think that hopefully showing an increase in density and more flexible development standards near those job centers, especially high-paying job centers, is really important, as well as in those high opportunity areas with access to good schools, parks, grocery stores. I really love this concept that we're talking about of addressing concentrations of privilege. And then lastly, I kind of want to tie back to a comment that Commissioner Lazo said in one of our first meetings there, needing to really consider the balances between all of the goals and call out that intersection between housing and transportation. Those are our household's two highest monthly expenses every single year or monthly. And so if we move to push a bunch of and plan for more affordable housing to be concentrated more at the edges of a community to decrease housing costs, I want to recognize that we're then putting a burden on those households to very likely to increase their transportation costs. Maybe they now need to purchase a car when it comes to payment, gas, maintenance, and those expenses. And so if we've lowered their housing costs, but then just increase their transportation costs, what have we really done to actually help promote affordability within our communities there? And I will leave it there for now. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks. So Brock, I'm going to come back to you. Victor, we haven't heard from you. Let's hear from you first, and then Brock, I'll jump back to you.
Sure. Thank you very much. So I'm going to combine a couple of those things for including affordability and how does the housing location and community needs. When I came to the US living in low-income housing, different perspective of right now where I am as an executive privileged individual where I can afford housing. What doesn't tend to happen is a lot of city government doesn't really have a communication within those individuals who really need to have their voices explained or heard. What happens a lot is, as a previous planning commissioner, the individuals that would come into planning commission or would raise voices and concerns were individuals who have a little more privilege. Unfortunately, we don't get to see a lot of government, city, local, going out to low-income housing unit developments and having those conversations. As a previous board member for Vienna Star, actually current board member, previous chair of Vienna Star, we don't get a lot of individuals coming out talking to the people who live in our communities and say, what do you need? Where do your needs stand? Unfortunately, those voices are the ones not heard in our community. So what I could say is, what local governments can do more is really to go out there and talk to those individuals and say, what can we do to address those needs? Because the voices that they really do hear are the ones that are out there having the same conversations had. Unfortunately, the ones that they need to hear are the ones that are often left behind. And even though sometimes there will be organizations paid for and brought on to help assist in that, unfortunately, those organizations don't really do the job needed within those communities. So I would say, really, if you want to know more about the community needs, really be out there in the community asking those questions for those individuals.
Yeah, thank you, Victor. And I want to come back to that in a second. So we'll go Brockton and Shane, because I do think, like, how then do you demonstrate that a city's done that due diligence, right? Or done that level of engagement to identify the needs. So I think the concept makes sense, right? Talk to people about what their needs are, but is there a way that DLCD should be thinking about how you demonstrate that in practice? Let's go Brockton, then Shane, and we'll keep diving deeper.
I think I'll touch on a few different comments that were made and kind of try to merge them together a little bit. But to kind of frame it all, I think, one, it's going to be very difficult to come up with specific metrics here as far as like quantifiable numbers. But with that said, I think they do have, a tie-in here. So, for example, Garrett made this comment, and I think Brian touched on it as well. Cutting regulatory red tape to make housing types that might be more affordable actually able to pencil is going to be huge for ensuring that. So if we can see regulations that have been cut, and as a result, more of those housing types are financially feasible for the developer and then start to be built more, I think that's one way to ensure that. How to ensure affordability specifically, I think, and this one is a little bit even more abstract, but as we're building housing, right, we all know, based on the reports that we've seen, that led to the work group, that led to the bill, that led to this, right? We know that there needs to be housing built at every income level. And I'm glad that I am not the first one that said this on the rack today. I think it was City of Wilsonville that mentioned it, but Miranda, you were absolutely correct when you said that, we're going to build things and people are going to buy them if they're available. And so, we have 140,000 units underproduced now. If we're not building everything, then that means that people that are in a higher income bucket are going to be able to outcompete lower income folks for the more affordable units that we're building. So it's really important that we see cities, in their outcomes, building housing of all types at all times. That's the only way that we're not going to have kind of a reverse filtering scenario where someone who otherwise could purchase potentially larger, slightly more expensive home that someone else with a lower income couldn't, is going to come in and buy that property. Because if we're not, regulating who can buy the home, which is probably going to get us into a lot of other fair housing issues, right? Then if it's sold on the market, the most competitive offer is going to be what ends up winning the day, so to speak. And so making sure that we're building enough of everything all at once to try to offset that as much as possible, so that the actual affordable units that we build are purchased or rented by people who need those more affordable units is going to be really essential.
Thanks, Brock. Shane?
Hi, thank you. I was wanting to speak on a very hyper-specific level to SROs. And this is tying a little bit with Victor's statement about trying to get more direct feedback from populations served. During the pandemic, I ended up exiting really intensive health services, and I was houseless for a time, and I was referred to a large social services provider's housing project that had PSH units, wraparound services located in the Powell-Hurst-Gilbert neighborhood. On a typology level, I could understand efficiency for the efficiency's sake to properly use funding, affordable housing dollar resources. This was like an institutionalized sardine can where there was one shower for every 10 units of people and one kitchen for 40 units of people. And then in relation to that, the turnover for the peer support workers is on average 2 to 3 months. And this is serving people exiting houselessness, incarceration, persistent mental health disturbances and drug treatment programs, all on the same floor where we were fighting for bathing, fighting for the right to cook. And it essentially was one of the most traumatic lived experiences of my life. And I ended up finding out that this building is owned by a San Francisco LLC that was funded by a Milwaukee, Wisconsin trust fund account. I bring this up hyper specifically because it is very rare that someone would have my lived experience while also being able to navigate these serpentine and Byzantine funding structures and the way that we end up creating housing in the first place. This means efficiency. How are we going to use our funding dollars appropriately, as efficiently as possible for the sake of our community? Then it goes to equity and quality concerns. Are we putting people in a better housing situation? Or are we essentially sweeping the rug and getting people out of houselessness, essentially to a kind of a private and enclosed asylum context? Because that shower, I had to hit it every 30 seconds for that shower to stay on. I bring up this hyper specific questions or details simply because it is important to look at how we efficiently use our resources. But if we do not see qualitative and reciprocal data between the people who are designing the spaces, allocating the funds, and then having more reciprocity for the population served, of course, at the end of the day, I appreciate being in that building as opposed to being houseless on the street, but it ends up being pushed into a rock and a hard place where you're supposed to feel grateful for a resource that the community provided, but it may not be allocated efficiently or fairly. And keeping in mind, any of us could end up being in that housing context at some point. So it's really just imagining, can we efficiently use our dollars in a way that's qualitatively assured and it is meeting people on a comfort level, especially in supportive housing service context. If you don't have that quality and comfort, then essentially you're just kind of warehousing people, trying to make it more efficient for services. And of course, this was the building where I had the most ethnic, income, immigrant, racial, and queer diversity ever in my life. And it just so happened to be essentially in a mental asylum context. So I hope that it didn't trigger anyone with my explanations of this, but hope to just usher in context. If we are going to serve our communities, are we doing it in a way that affirmatively furthers fair housing in an equitable and a comfort-laden context? Otherwise, we could just be reinstitutionalizing trauma.
Shane, thank you for both the thoughtfulness of your comments and sharing so specifically. Let's go, Julia, and then Kathleen.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to say thank you to Shane for sharing that lived experience. And it's reflective of something I wanted to bring up was just kind of reiterating the importance of trauma-informed design in kind of this whole everything, but especially in housing types that we feel are most likely to be serving our more vulnerable and marginalized populations. And so just being real, again, people first, people centered approaches to how we're talking about housing, I think is just so key here. And then relating that back to kind of the engagement piece. Again, I think there's so much to be learned from those lived experiences of people who have lived in these spaces, need these spaces, and we need to really make sure that however we're encouraging cities to do that or requiring cities to do that, that again, it's trauma-informed, it's respectful of these lived experiences, respectful that engagement can be re-traumatizing, and building off of feedback that has already been given as opposed to requesting it to be done over and over and over and over and over again. There's so many good papers out there, research documents that have been done by organizations like Coalitions of Communities of Colors and many others that are really ingrained in these communities that we're saying we want to serve. And I think leaning on those first versus requiring individual every project engagement, every plan engagement, I think should be part of how DLCD can kind of be like, yes, you've done your homework. Like you've referenced these documents. You haven't just gone out there and done like a online survey and hoped the right people showed up. So I would just put that out there as a key way to kind of measure success in that space.
Thanks, Julie. You always beat me to the follow-up question, so thank you for that. I was like, well, how do you do that, right? And I think using reference points and documenting what we've heard before, and resourcing from what folks have previously said is a great example. Thank you for that. Kathleen?
Yeah, I wanted to speak to the location issue.
Please.
And one of the things we haven't talked about is conversion of office buildings and other commercial spaces. If you go downtown Portland or even drive down Sandy Boulevard or Hollywood, there are so many empty storefronts. There are so many empty commercial spaces that are near services that are on transit routes, and they need to be used in order to build housing, and we need to shift focus to be sure they're included because they're definitely part of the BLI.
All right, thanks, Kathleen. So Brock, I'm going to come to you in a second. I do want to, I know we're getting towards the end of our time. I want to invite anyone, we've had all 4 questions, but anyone who hasn't contributed yet, I really do want to invite you in, even if you just say, I'm good. But love to hear from someone we haven't heard from, without putting too much pressure on y'all. But just want to create that space, make sure you feel invited to offer some perspective. Lucia?
I just wanted to speak to, oops, here we go. I just wanted to speak to putting things out at the edges of communities. We mentioned that could be expensive for the families that move out there, but it's also expensive to serve those locations for all types of services. It's harder for social services to get out there. It's harder for transit to run out there. It's harder to build the roads and the water and the sewer and on the electric lines and all that go out there. So consider the whole cost, not just to the family, but to the community and possibly to the developers if SDCs are reflective of that cost. And then earlier we talked about whether retail should be on the bottom of all things. And I think a mix of stuff is better. A lot of places are over retailed, and a mix of stuff is more interesting. If there's some retail on the ground floor, if there's some live work unit, if there's some horizontal multi-housing, if there's some vertical multi-housing, all mixed up would make a much more interesting and viable environment for folks.
Yeah, thank you for that, Lucia. Brock, and then Anne, I see you came off mute. Was that your indication that you want to jump in?
Sure, yeah.
Let's go, Brock, and then I'll go to you. Brock?
My apologies. I meant to tie this onto my last comment as well, but forgot item 3 on my list. As Brian mentioned as well, it can be more difficult to build affordable housing in kind of those dense urban environments, and they have had success in Bend, being able to actually have that affordable housing pencil in expansion areas. So I think that's important to note, but particularly as we're talking about cost as it relates to location, yes, housing, transportation are the 2 highest costs, housing first, then transportation. We can reduce transportation costs by having people live in denser urban environments. But the real question as it relates to overall life affordability there is whether being that close where your transportation costs reduce get offset by the increased cost of housing because of prevailing wage for taller, higher density buildings, and increased amenities and shops and stuff nearby, right? Those are all things that make an area more desirable, and therefore more expensive when it comes to the market. And so, yes, there is definitely a cost trade-off to living further away, but whether that cost trade-off is enough to offset the change in housing costs is going to be really important to consider.
Thanks. Anita, did you want to jump in?
Sure, this is probably a little late in the discussion, but it is also something for consideration ongoing is what are some other things that affect housing affordability. We heard about financing, land availability, things that are outside, this is a question, outside the jurisdiction of land use and DLCD's authority, but actually could be some other opportunities that you think, underwriting, some of those things, taxing, things like that, I think are important for this group to think about. And this is not the only time you can be able to talk about it, but I think this is also an issue to think about, other opportunities for advocacy as well, and a report to the commission as well.
Yeah, thanks. That's great, Anita. Appreciate that. Let's go Ann, then Miranda, then Mac, and then I'll do one last call for anyone who hasn't had the chance to contribute, and then we'll work towards closing. So Ann, jump in.
Thank you. I appreciate all the discussion about the need for affordable housing near amenities and the cost of transportation and so forth. But there is also an extremely high cost of childcare. I mean, it's basically like college tuition now, and there's a need for single parents and young families to be able to live in communities near their own parents, near their own extended family. There is a need for these households to live in neighborhoods, just like what we've been planning for the different housing types of middle housing within existing single family neighborhoods or single detached home neighborhoods. So I would really like to see, as part of planning for equitable distribution of affordability, some kind of incentive built into the middle housing regulations toward affordability.
Right, thank you. Miranda, and then Mac.
Yeah, one thing I did want to raise about like the questions related to planning for characteristics is, depending on what we're talking about in terms of those characteristics, which it sounds like many of them might be inside the building, in addition to accessing the structure, it feels like many of those may dive into the realm of building code issues. And the state building code is obviously governed at the state level. And there's a lot of things there that we can't, as like kind of on the front end of development review, address, like if it's not consistent with building code. So I think one of the things here is that could be a barrier or a limitation or an impact of this work, is like, how do we inform a building code that could improve and allow for greater flexibility or allow these things. I'm not quite sure what that will result in, but I just wanted to elevate that there's a lot of things that we don't actually govern at kind of the development review and approval stage, and to some extent could be challenged by developers as takings. So I know, I think Ben mentioned that quite a while ago, just about like some of these things get into takings, but like we're already being challenged around that in terms of like accessibility and full accessibility versus mobility ready versus visitability. And those are needed housing types we know we need to plan for and want to put in our zoning code, but we're already being challenged on that. So I think for us, I think those are limitations and barriers that we're going to need to discuss as we get to probably some of these recommendations and rules, because there's a limit to, I think, what this process can do. I don't think we can impact the state building code through this process. But I think that there's a real relationship there that is worth discussing and trying to come up with some recommendations or solutions to.
Great. Thank you, Miranda. Mac?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I'm gonna hopefully try to keep this brief, but I really want to just respond to Anita's question of like, what are the things that are also contributing to barriers for more affordability in the housing that we want to see? And I'm really thankful that Miranda just went before me and she named one of those, which is the building code. Yeah, there are, I mean, and building, so one, like to back up even a little bit, like I think this is not going to be a surprising statement in this room, hopefully, but zoning and zoning reform are not a silver bullet to fixing our state's affordable housing and housing crises. It is definitely an area that needs reform. And if, we don't zone to build a certain type of housing, clearly we can not ever build it. And so removing that barrier is really important. And all the different levers and more like dimmer switches really within zoning code to help get projects that are just barely not penciling to begin to pencil. But some of those external barriers really being within the building code existing. There's a lot of redundancies within the building code, and I think for good reason in a lot of spaces. We obviously don't want to build substandard housing. We don't want to build housing that's going to only have a useful life of 30 years or something like that, and God forbid, compromise anything on fire life safety. But there are certain things within that building code that still have not, I think, been updated to match the modern technologies that we can integrate within a building system. And I think HPAC outside of the space within the single stair reform proposal is kind of addressing that. That's another can of worms though. And then I want to name also financing, at least when it comes to income restricted affordable housing, which is going to be most of that housing, new construction that will serve those lower income levels. And it's really those underwriting requirements that create those gaps that then need to be filled through public subsidy to make those buildings happen. And I don't know if there's a space maybe outside of this meeting that might make more sense to hopefully talk a little bit about how banks, underwrite deals and how that income restriction and rent caps that sort of come within that for deed restricted affordable housing, how that interplays, but would be happy to share those resources if that would be helpful. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mac. Well, I'll do one last call if anyone who hasn't contributed wants to share. Otherwise, we'll start moving into our closing. So I'll just pause. I want to jump in.
This is Anna, she, her. No, I really appreciated the discussion and all the points that people have shared. And then it just makes me think of housing that's needed in community. Thinking I think Anne had shared something about office buildings and then the bottom floor being commercial, but at the same time it made me think of these buildings could also be repurposed for housing, and then how are they also climate resilient, and those bottom floors that can be communal can be climate resilience hubs for those folks in that area. And so it makes me think, and then thinking of housing built for longer term, and what community needs now is also housing that is more insulated and has heating and cooling, considering that the changing needs in our climate are happening. And when we're thinking about building housing, how are we taking that into account as well? So were a couple of the thoughts that popped into my head as we were wrapping up this conversation.
Thank you, Anna. And that ties back to some of the conversations certainly that the TAC has been exploring, right? That intersection between kind of the characteristics and type of housing and the needs, future needs and sustainability needs as we're building out into the future. Any last folks we haven't heard from? Thank you, Anna, for jumping in. Okay, well, with that, let's begin our closing. I will just start with just an appreciation of the depth of the conversation and folks, real attempts to, as Anita said earlier, to hold close the equity framework. And Julie, I think you said it a couple times in important ways, and folks like Shane and others kind of made it real, right? Is to be focused on the people, right? And be people first, and recognize that we can talk about land use, we can talk about housing structure and financing, but not losing focus of the whom and how people are impacted and how people's needs are being met. So just really express that appreciation and know that this will be a thread that weaves through the conversations as we go forward. I did want to, I don't think this was on our agenda, but Madi, I think particularly wanted to create any space for you and Celestina, just as our NAPTAC reps. If you had any reflections or things that are coming up for you, wanted to create a little space there. I know that I didn't give you a heads up on that, so just want to leave a little space for you if you have any reflections.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Or Ben. I'm thinking, sorry about that. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, I guess I'll just offer words of appreciation to everyone for engaging and embracing this discussion. It's the real hard work of, I think, what we're trying to hit and grapple with at NAPTAX. A lot of this feedback is helpful and informative, and I appreciate, all of that, all of this feedback, kind of leaning into the work, and also, really leaning into, I think, the principles that we're trying to kind of tackle, which is affirmatively furthering fair housing, and at the core, having people and considering that in planning and beyond, because that's what I heard. So, yeah, thank you. And definitely a lot to bring forward at the NAPTAC level for them to continue to grapple with. And I'm excited for the more in-depth discussions at the NAPTAC level, and excited for the next time we reconvene. And hopefully we can, have options for y'all to consider. I'll hand it over to my colleague to offer thoughts.
Yeah, Celestina?
Thanks so much, Maddie and Ben, and I'll echo the gratitude. A lot of really, really thoughtful comments today, and I wanted to appreciate both, everyone's interest in understanding what we can do in the bounds of the space and what this particular, advisory committee is focusing on in our scope, while also understanding that, the Housing Production Strategy Program is a program that includes public-private partnership as strategies that cities can use. And so I just appreciate what everyone's bringing into the space, whether it's what we think of when we typically think of land use planning or beyond. I just kind of wanted to note that it's all part of the work. So thank you for the awareness of what is in our lane, and also for maybe reaching one lane over at times, because we're really bringing it all into this program. And just a note on that last point that you brought up, Mac, I think about lending and financing, and we heard it elsewhere as well. Rachel, who wasn't here today, is an affordable housing lender. So we've hoped to craft these rooms to bring all of those conversations in, and to see what we can do and what we can advocate for. And thanks for that as well, Anita, that prompt. So that's all I'll add for today, and really looking forward to continuing with you all.
Appreciate that. And then Commissioner Lazo, I also know I didn't give you a heads up, but as our liaison to LCDC Commission, I guess I'm curious if there's anything that you're hearing that you want this group to hold, or anything that you just wanted to provide for reflection.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I appreciate that. And I'll just echo what folks have said about appreciating comments from folks today that are thoughtful and provoking. I think the one thing I would say, it also illustrates the mission in front of us as the RAC and as the LCD and as the commission, and how complex this issue is. And as Mac pointed out, how the complexity is in how we balance all the buckets that are coming up, whether or not it's how we reach affordability, what levers cities have, what public-private partnerships there may be. There's so much for us to balance to reach the goals that we have, that this process is enriching. But we're going to narrow down this freeway that we're traveling down to some real decisions we're going to have to make about what gets into policy, what gets into regulations. And so I appreciate folks moving along that pathway with us, and look forward to those conversations as we kind of narrow those down.
Good, thank you. I know we're diving deep into our metaphors here, so I appreciate that as we close out. Anita, I know I didn't give you a heads up either, so I just wanted to offer any space as you kind of reflect back on kind of where we started in this conversation on the equity framework, and what you're hearing, and maybe some prompts or considerations for folks as we continue to build out this space together.
Thanks, Ben. And thanks everybody for the discussion and for the opportunity for me to kind of prompt you in different ways. We really rely on the RAC and all your experience to help build this. And so really we want to make sure that things sound really technical. They are in certain ways, but there's also an opportunity for those of you to weigh in that are maybe not doing the implementation, but the impact on you, especially I'm talking about the folks that the affordable housing is meant for, and people who are doing the advocacy. It's so important to have that understanding for access for you all. I mean, I think the things that Shane, and I'm just going to call out Shane because sharing that vulnerability of the experience was really important that I'm sure many people have never experienced. And so that is so really courageous of you. And I hope that other folks who are on this rack, which has been meant to be balanced for this kind of experience, Anna, thank you for also jumping in. And we're going to really encourage you all to really share this because Victor, people who work with the folks that are really in the need, we need to hear this on how this accessibility can work. And it's also going to just help the local governments do a better job of doing that as well. So thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Anita. And so I appreciate that. I won't call on anybody that doesn't know they're coming, but Ethan, you know that you're helping close us out, so I'll pass it to you.
Yes, thank you, Ben. And yeah, I get the great opportunity just to kind of reiterate all the the gratitude and thanks for the conversation today. Obviously, this is what we're all here to do, is have those conversations out in the open so that they can inform the recommendations and kind of go through that policy development and that kind of policy refinement and shining process. So in terms of next steps, obviously we've got our next meeting of the Rulemaking Advisory Committee on the 30th of April. So be looking for a meeting packet and notice to come your way 1 week prior to that. After this meeting, you'll get an email from likely Ingrid Caudell about a post-meeting survey. So within that survey are the exact same questions that we posed today in terms of discussion for you to further reflect on, debrief with your constituents or your peers on those questions, provide additional feedback, but then also some questions just about this process in general, how it's been going, how we can alter processes to better encourage or provide additional comfort for you in your participation in this process. So really looking to you all to provide that feedback, and feel free to share away in terms of responding to that survey. I also do want to kind of highlight a couple things that we're trying out in terms of making folks feel a little bit more prepared for these meetings. So we're hosting these kind of drop-in sessions prior to Rulemaking Advisory Committee meetings. We're trying to queue those up for the Friday before, and we'll have to kind of work on the timing. I know that this go around, it was really short notice. We published the packet on a Thursday and then held the drop-in session on a Friday. So just know that those are a good space for folks to come, and as you're reviewing the packet materials prior to this meeting itself, to have a space to come and chat with DLCD staff about clarifications and so on and so forth that you might be, or things that are coming up for you in those kind of questions or discussion in the packet of materials. So those are entirely optional. We won't be discussing any like policy, so to speak, in those settings, more about clarifications and any questions on process that you might have. Finally, one last thing before we all depart. I know that there's been some questions about like how do RAC members potentially engage outside of the Rulemaking Advisory Committee process, and how those folks engage with their partners and their coalitions, and just wanted to kind of make clear that DLCD is not kind of facilitating any of those kind of external to the Rulemaking Advisory Committee process. And that we had talked about kind of the public noticing that is required by DLCD should a quorum of RAC members take place. And that really is within the context of the things that DLCD itself is convening. So those kind of external to the RAC coalition meetings or conversations, those are not things that DLCD is officially participating in, and therefore we don't feel a necessity to kind of publicly notice those items. So I know there was some confusion about could we meet outside of this setting, or what happens if there happens to be a group of RAC members that are part of a conversation outside of this space, that is okay, as long as DLCD is not convening those and we don't have to public notice those. So I just wanted to make those kind of points, but thank you all again for your time. And I know I've already gone over noon, so I will leave it at that.
Thanks, Ethan. Well, we're at 12:01, so minus 1 minute from our meeting, but appreciate everyone. Much love. Thanks for the great engagement today, and we'll see you next time. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.